Chapter 2. Whoosh! A damp breeze whisked me from the stool where I'd been sitting, twirled me until I was dizzy, and plopped me down on a lumpy sack somewhere cold and dark. Dazed, I shook my head and looked around. It could have been worse. At least I knew where I was, my parents' dungeon, and the door was most certainly locked. I'd visited the dungeon often, but always dressed warmly and carrying a torch. It wasn't safe to walk around the dungeon in the dark. Unseen hands moved barrels, holes appeared where there were none before, and doors that were centuries old suddenly disappeared. Witches had lived in castles for generations, and here, where the early witches had set up their workshops, magic had permeated the walls and still floated around in currents and eddies that smelled like rotting vegetables. My mother, who wasn't a witch, had ordered the dungeon be cleaned out and now used it for storage, but the witches' ghosts remained to haunt the old dungeon, and not all of them were friendly. My mother didn't believe in ghosts and kept the salt in the room where I now found myself, a long, narrow room that had once been used as a torture chamber. Why had I wanted salt for the eggs again? The torture chamber had no windows, not even the faintest glimmer disturbed the inky dark. I thought about using my magic to go back upstairs, but I didn't know any spells that would take me from one place to another, and although I wanted to practice my magic, I didn't think I was ready to try to come up with my own spells yet, especially since it was a simple spell that had brought me back to the dungeon. To get out safely, I needed some sort of light. A tethered witch's light would have to do, even though it would be vulnerable to the old magic wafting through the dungeon. One of the first spells my aunt had taught me was to create such a light. I'd used it many times, but only when Gracina was around. I recited the spell, shaping my hands as if I was holding a ball. Create a glow to chase the dark, a light to help me see. Let neither wind, nor rain, nor snow take it away from me. The space between my hands began to glow a rosy shade of pink, and a ball of light took form. I released the ball, and it drifted above my head. I'd started toward the door when a whisper of a sound behind me made me turn to look. A swirling mist glowing a faint blue poured through a hole in the wall. As the mist filled the room, a young woman appeared, only a few feet away, her long tresses lifting in a non-existent breeze. She gazed at me through shadowed eyes, her lips moving, her hands reaching in a pleading sort of gesture. An aura as cold as winter's night surrounded her, giving me goosebumps when she drew near. Her lips moved again, and I strained to hear her words. "I'm sorry," I said, tilting my head so I might hear her better. "Could you repeat that?" The ghost sighed and dropped her arms to her sides. "Listen carefully this time," she yelled. "I hate repeating myself. I said, 'Help, help, save me. The executioner is coming, and I've done nothing wrong.'" She spoke in a matter-of-fact way, as if reciting lines that she'd repeated too often. "Too late," said a voice by the wall. "I'm already here." A broad-chested ghost dressed in all black materialized before us. His eyes glowed crimson through the holes of his hood covering his head. Silently, the executioner wielded an axe, its blade dark with blood. The young lady shrieked and started to run. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, her head lay on the floor, gazing up in silent reproach. "That was good," I said, "although it works better when you delay your entrance, Cranston. It's more effective when Margaret convinces me of her innocence first." "Sorry," said the executioner, "we're both a bit off today. We've had so many visitors lately, stomping around in heavy boots, thrusting torches in dark corners." "Why are they here?" I asked. Cranston shrugged. "Looking for something, I suppose. We're much better with the torture scene. Would you like to see that one? It's much more realistic." No thanks," I said, never having cared for such gruesome historic reenactments that some of the ghosts enjoyed. "I have too much to do this morning." The ghost disappeared, leaving me alone once again. I was stepping into the next room when my witch's light dimmed so much I could barely see. Something scrabbled against the stone floor like scores of metal hard claws. I took another step, hoping to take the light out of the drifting pool of magic that muted its glow. A large shape loomed out of the dark, its glowing red eyes unblinking. If I hadn't encountered such a creature before, I would have been terrified, but Gracina had shown me how to deal with one on one of our early visits. It was a shadow monster left behind by one of my ancestors, and could be deadly to anyone who didn't know its weakness. I took one more step into the room, and the creature charged. It was almost upon me when I danced aside, wrapping it between its eyes with my clenched fist. As its eyes were its only vulnerable spot, the shadow beast whined and fled to the old torture chamber. I took another tentative step, not caring to fall into a bottomless pit or tread on a magic serpent created by an old spell. My witch's light grew brighter, lighting the darkened corners. I was halfway across the floor when a pale glow played around the edge of the door, outlining it in an eerie blue light. The light pulsed and wavered, seeming to seep through the door itself. It grew stronger the closer it came, finally taking on the shape of a man, taller than most, with shoulder-length white hair and finely chiseled features. Although the image remained translucent, I recognized him right away. Grandfather, you're back. I thought you were still away on ghostly business. I smiled up at the holes where his eyes should have been. Clammy fingers touched my hand, and the scent of old leather grew strong. My darling Emma, he answered, a chilly puff of air caressing my cheek. I'm sorry I was away for so long. The meeting of the Council of Ghosts seems to last longer every year. I hear that you were away as well. Christina told me something about a frog and a prince. You remind me of your grandmother. She was always doing this unexpected too. Still is, from what I hear. You even look like her in a way. What? I was horrified at the idea of resembling my grandmother in even the smallest detail. Although I had my father's large nose, I'd been told that with my taller-than-average height, auburn hair, and green eyes, I looked like my Aunt Christina. This was the first time anyone had ever compared me to my grandmother. Her long hooked nose, pointed chin, beady eyes, and warts with straggly white hair was enough to frighten me, and I couldn't imagine that anyone would want to look like her. At least no one had ever accused me of acting like my grandmother. You know, Olivine wasn't always the way she is now. She was quite lovely when I married her, and she was the sweetest, gentlest woman. It wasn't until your mother and your Aunt Christina were nearly grown that your grandmother changed. You're talking about the family curse, aren't you? So you've heard about how the first Green Witch, Hazel, insulted a fairy? I had. It was Hazel's 16th birthday, and she didn't have enough everlasting bouquets to give to one fairy. The fairy got angry and cursed Hazel, and that if she ever touched a flower, she'd end up nasty like my grandmother was now. Aunt Christina told me the curse was still strong, and that any female in our family who touched a flower after she turned 16 would become a nasty hag. Oh, yes, I said. And you believe it? Of course. Why wouldn't I asked. Because your grandmother didn't, at least not until it happened. Her mother avoided flowers her entire life, but Olivine thought her mother was crazy, so she didn't believe her stories about the curse. After the curse changed her, your grandmother didn't care enough to do anything except send me to the dungeons. Is that how you ended up down here? A ghostly sigh brushed my ear. Before the change, Olivine complained that I never took her to tournaments or balls at neighboring kingdoms anymore. I didn't know that she ever wanted to go. I thought she was happy raising our girls and running the castle. She was always so busy with her magic. When your grandmother said that if I loved her, I'd be more attentive and bring her little gifts, I tried to please her. You mean you're the one that gave her the flowers that turned her into— Yes, I was the one. I never heard of the curse, but ignorance is no excuse. After I gave her the flowers and she changed, she used her magic to send me to the dungeon for a few days. I could have left any time after that, but I liked the peace and quiet. I could understand why he'd want to stay in the dungeon. I had heard from my mother and my aunt how they fought when they were young, and if my grandmother had been as nasty as she was now, the dungeon would have been the nicest place in the castle. I haven't seen your grandmother for years, but the funny thing is I miss her. I saw your mother the other day, though. She stopped by to see if you were here. Chartreuse didn't come down very often, I'm sorry to say. Why was she looking for you in the dungeons? Maybe because she couldn't find me anywhere else. I kissed a frog named Edric in the swamp, and then I became a frog too. Until yesterday, that is. That's when I kissed him again with my charm reversal bracelet back on, and we both turned back into humans. Edric is a prince, and he wants to marry me, but I told him we have to wait and see. Do you love him? Your mother says love isn't essential in a marriage, but it really is, you know. When we were young, I loved your grandmother so much. I guess I love him in a way, I said. I just didn't know if I loved him enough, not after seeing how Christina loved her betrothed, Haywood. He'd been missing for years, but my grandmother had turned him into an otter. I'm not ready for marriage yet anyway. I want to study magic first. Last night Aunt Christina told me if I work at it hard enough, I might be the Green Witch someday. Just like her mother was before her. Grandmother was the Green Witch? Before the curse took hold, she was the nicest as well as the most powerful witch around. Those are both requirements for being the Green Witch, you know. Grandfather floated beside me as I started towards the door. Now how did you get down here? He asked. Well, we're going to the old witch's retirement community this morning to see Grandmother and ask her to turn Haywood back into a human. She wants more grandchildren, and my parents aren't about to have more, so I think she'll do it. But I wanted to make breakfast first. Are you sure it's wise to ask your grandmother for help? She's a stubborn woman. You're going to have a difficult time changing her mind about Haywood. Even she has to see how much Christina and Haywood love each other. We were passing through a long corridor, and I could see the stairway leading out of the dungeon at the far end. Ooh, wailed a voice. I smell a maiden with hair aflame. Go on with you. You can't smell the color of her hair, said an older and less refined voice. I was being poetic, said the first voice. You could have let me finish. Oh, go on then. What else were you going to say? I forget now, and it's a real shame because it was going to be beautiful. The voice grew fainter. At the approach of ghosts, the temperature of the room dropped even further. I don't think I've met those ghosts before, I began. They seem Achoo! I knew right away the sneeze wasn't an ordinary one. The tickling that started in my nose filled my head, then rushed down my neck and into my entire body. I felt myself flash hot, then cold, and my skin was suddenly sensitive to the air currents wafting through the dungeon. I could clearly hear the sound of rats scurrying behind closed doors. "Good gracious, child," said my grandfather, "what happened to you?" "I don't know," I said, reaching for my tickling nose, but to my surprise, my nose wasn't there. I patted my face and then ran my hands over the top of my head, feeling the smooth, moist, hairless skin. "I can't believe this! I turned back into a frog! What's wrong with me, Grandfather? Why can't I do anything right? I achoo!" I sneezed explosively, and suddenly I was back to my normal self. "Are you all right, Emma?" I patted my hair into place, glad that I at least had hair again. "Fine, I guess. But why did I change when I sneezed? I can't help you there. I don't understand magic very well." We had reached the end of the corridor and started to climb the stairs, and I felt the tickling again. Not wanting to turn back into a frog, I pinched my nose. When the urge to sneeze faded, I took my hand from my face and said, "I'd better get going before— Achoo!" I'd only let go briefly, but it had been enough. I was once again a frog. "Perhaps if you sneeze again," said Grandfather, "you might turn yourself back." It wasn't hard to do. I took a deep breath and felt the tickling sensation in my nose. The sneeze was coming, and it was going to be a big one. Achoo! I shot back to my normal size and shape, but the tickling wasn't over. Achoo! My stomach lurched, and I turned back into a frog. Too many changes too fast was too much. Achoo! I instantly turned into a human, clapped my hand over my face, and squeezed my nose shut, so hard that it hurt. "Here," said my grandfather, reaching through the door to unlock it. "Go before you change again. I love you no matter what shape you're in, but I'd rather have a human granddaughter than a frog one."